Who do you hire and who do you fire, and how is psychological testing used by employers to find the best people for the job? That's Theme 6, Episode 1, coming up. And, the balloons? The balloons? Well, this is the last lecture. We made it. We made it all the way through to Theme 6, so congratulations to you. And brace yourselves, because here we go with the final episode. So psychological assessment is a key part of employee selection these days and has been for a while. Such tests inform employer decisions on hire, placement, promotion and performance monitoring. And they're also used extensively in career advising. Now, much of this work is done in an area of psychology known as industrial and organizational psychology. And this is the area of psychology that looks at job satisfaction, leadership styles, employee motivation, and other factors that are believed to impact the performance of organizations. There's also a field of personnel psychology, which is more focused on job analysis, job recruitment, and employee performance measurement. Now, I've posted a funny story for you on our Moodle site underneath this video podcast. It's from the Confessions podcast. It's a radio show in the UK where people write in their confessions and the radio hosts decide whether forgiveness is warranted. Anyway, hope it makes you smile. It points to how shabby employee selection processes can be, and they can really be quite shabby. You may have direct experience of this yourself. I know I do. So in this episode, we're going to look briefly at testing that has benefit for the individual, and then testing that has benefit for the organization. Now, any test should have both benefits, but in reality, this is not always the case. You know, the ideal is to identify what the individual is interested in and then match that person to the right job, and then in theory, you'll have a happy employee. Someone doing the stuff they love and a happy organization, having a productive worker. When we get into testing to benefit an organization, here we see the work of organizational psychologists, where the key aim is to help the organization work well. It's in this context that we'll talk about employment interviews as an employee selection method, as there are some things here that might surprise you. Well, maybe not. Depends on your experience with these things, as all things. But all of that is coming up later. Let's start off by looking at the testing that is intended to first benefit the individual. Here, career counselling is a prominent practice. The intent behind psychological testing in careers counselling is that identifying the interests of the client will help when advising them on which career direction to take. And sometimes we need someone to help us with this, as we can sometimes have trouble seeing such things clearly ourselves, or we may not have considered some options that might be available to us. So a psychological test that helps a client to identify their career interests could be beneficial. And one of the most popular psychological tests here are the interest inventories. These things started around 90 years ago. And there's a link on this slide to a resource for more information about these inventories. And you can read about them in our prescribed text in the latter part of chapter 11, topic 11b. So let's have a quick look at the strong vocational interest blank. Yes, it's blank, not bank. Hey, that confuses me too. Also, strong is the name of the guy who invented this thing. It's not a reference to the power of the test. So when I say this is a strong test, it's Strong's test, not a strong test. You get it? Strong is not an adjective. Anyway, moving on. So this test came about as a result of research that surveyed patterns of interest among workers from different occupational groups. These are known as the criterion groups. People in these different occupational groups were selected on the basis that they were happy with their work. And the research asked them about their general interests, and from this a test was developed that would help identify which occupational group a person was suited for, based on that person's general interests. So interests like sport, I like competition in sport or art. I like activities that allow me to express myself, that kind of thing. Well, the research led to a list of around 400 items about the likes and dislikes of people in different occupational groups. And you can find examples of the types of items on these inventories in our prescribed text. What's been said about the strong vocational interest blank is that interest patterns have remained relatively stable over time. The other thing that has been said is that a person's interest patterns become pretty much established by the time they're 17, that they don't vary too much after that age. This was what was being found by research up until about 1960s, 1970s. But this was also an era where some problems were identified with the inventories. First, they were very practice-focused. This work was very much rooted in applied psychology. Now, this came at the expense of theory. Strong had not provided an explanation to account for people's different preferences or interests. So no theory laid behind what was stated, at least, and there was no stated theory, but there was an unstated theory that you can see in the assumptions that the work rested on. Overall, it appeared to rest on a version of trait theory of personality. Can you see why? Have a think. This will help you understand trait theory if you can see what the connection is here. What I'll do is, tell you what, I'll list some of the assumptions. I'll write them out on this, here we go, on this slide. So you can see the assumptions behind the test. So assumption 1, each occupation has a desirable pattern of interests and personality characteristics among its workers. Assumption number 2, each individual has a relatively stable set of interests and personality traits. See, personality theory coming in, personality traits. They have personality traits and such. When such interests and traits match the desirable interest patterns of the occupation, the individual has a high probability to enter that occupation and be more likely to succeed in it. Assumption number 3, it's highly possible to differentiate individuals in a given occupation from others in general in terms of the desirable patterns of interests and traits for that occupation. Now, there's another problem with the inventories. There was a gender bias in the test, and this criticism came most strongly in the 1970s. Now, do you know why this happened in the 1970s? Have a think. This issue's come up a few times in this unit. Hit pause on this video if you need a bit of time to think about it. If you've hit paused or you come back to me and you want the answer, or you just want the answer right away, or you know what the answer is and you just want me to get it over and done with, well, yep, the answer is the civil rights movement. That was really kicking off at this time, particularly the women's movement. And a lot of practices in psychology were coming under scrutiny and criticism at that time. Now, the problem was that the inventory had separate forms for men and women, and the one for women featured lower status and lower salaried careers, and sex stereotype, gender stereotyped careers like nursing, clerical work and teaching. In 1974, the inventory was redeveloped by Campbell to address those criticisms. And Campbell brought the male and female inventories together into one inventory and sought to remove the gender bias. In particular, gender-biased occupational terminology was changed. Salesman, waitress, actress, job titles that we no longer use because they are inappropriately gender specific. And these changes to the inventory were partially successful, but there was evidence that a gender bias still remained in the inventory. Now, much of the work that has happened in psychology in relation to removing psychology's bias against women and black people, amongst others, disabled people and so on, Western people, list goes on. All of that began to get addressed in the 1970s, but much of that work has yet to be fully completed. A lot of the work is ongoing, and a lot of the criticisms still stand in relation to the biases against certain groups, as you'll have seen in this unit. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on these inventories because our prescribed text does that, but there is an interesting bit of history here between Strong and Campbell. Basically, they had a bit of a dust-up, a bit of a fight. Not fisticuffs, but more of a strong disagreement. Actually, it was more of a fight between their respective universities, which went into legal dispute over who owned the inventory. The result was that Campbell went off to publish his own inventory, known as the Campbell Interest and Skill Survey, which is now quite widely used. Now, one thing's missing here with these inventories, particularly the idea that your interests stabilise by your late teens, and from those interests we can discern your ideal career. Do you know what's missing here? What's missing is the fact that the labour market has changed since then. We are rapidly losing the idea, perhaps it's already gone, that a career is for life, lifelong. You just walk into a job, you leave school, go into your first job, and you have that job for the rest of your life. Job for life, career for life. Now, this was the case in the past, but no more. Now it's all about flexibility and having multiple careers, moving from one career path to another career path, and doing so multiple times in your working life. And you can see this change reflected in how, since around the 1990s, universities started to focus on lifelong learning, which is all about adapting to this new labour market of moving from one career to another many times. So these inventories that are premised on a version of trait theory where we have a core consistent set of traits, solid, stable areas of interest, it seems to be poorly matched to the lives that many of us live these days. There are other ways of looking at a human condition that describe people as inconsistent and as having multiple selves, multiple versions of themselves, and being in constant state of change. And this view of a unitary, consistent model of the self might be putting psychology out of step with the reality of many people's lives. People are in a constant state of change. Now, let's go into organizational psychology, where we move beyond the interest of the individual, the person being tested, and instead move to think about the interests of the organization, the interests of the employer. Now, here is where things get interesting again, because we know that employment interviews are a poor selection method. Research has consistently shown this, yet interviews are very widely used, both to select employees and to decide on an employee's eligibility for promotion. So what happens in an employment interview? Well, what we tend to find is that the first few moments of the interview are the key part of the interview. It's the part where the first impression is made by the interviewee. This first impression is made up of how confident you appear when you come into the room, how you're dressed, the eye contact you give, your posture and your gait, and your initial communication. And those first few moments, typically, less than a couple of minutes really, no more than 5 minutes, is the point at which the outcome of the interview is largely determined. Everything after those first few moments is just used by the interviewing panel to confirm their original impression. It is really difficult to shift from that first impression. If you make a good first impression, you have to be really, really, really dreadful in the rest of the interview for that first impression not to determine the outcome of the interview. Now, does it surprise you? Did you know that employment interviews were such a bad method of selecting employees? They're really bad. They're a really bad form of psychological test. Well, the reassuring news is that employment interviews are seldom used alone. They're usually used in conjunction with other information that can come from psychological testing, short questionnaires, from what's known as biodata, information that you put on your CV or resume. But even then, the interview tends to be the final part of the process, the bit where the final decision is made. Now, in our prescribed test, you'll read about how the interview's been improved through being more structured, through changing the types of questions that are asked. But having researched this field extensively myself early in my career, I can tell you that the interview method is still an awful method of selecting people. The main reason is that in an interview, people present a particular part of themselves. Most people, it's a good way to select someone. Well, the interview is good for selecting people who will be good in a sales position or in a media appointment, have to present to camera like this. Not saying. Anyway, I wasn't selected to do this work. This is why I'm not so good at it. It's good at selecting someone who can be very convincing in regards to selling you any old piece of junk. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not selling you junk in this podcast. But a salesperson might sell you junk or might sell you stuff that you don't actually need or don't want, but they're very good at persuading you that you do. It might be good at someone pretending to be someone they're not, an actor or a TV presenter. Rather than just be yourself, people become the person that they think the interviewer wants them to be. And if they get the job, they can go back to being themselves again. Now, the other issue with employment interviews is that they let in too much information that can bias our decisions in a bad way. And our decision might be swayed by someone's looks, their physical appearance, their accent, their tone of voice, colour of their eyes, even how they smell. And the interviewer can end up liking someone because of these things. And all sorts of these biases come in, and it's really hard to remove those biases. Now, personnel psychologists have known this for years, that employment interviews are really bad tools for selecting the best candidate for the job. But personnel psychologists have had to try to improve the interview or find ways of offsetting its worst features, because employers generally are very, very attached to the employment interview as a selection method. The panel interview was brought in. We have multiple interviewers all lined up behind a desk grilling you. It's quite intimidating if you have to go through that sort of thing.
So, you want your job?
What do you do?
Me and they have made hunter. Me all together.
You hunt together.
They take many men. So, they will say us having. They get more time. Hunter? Maybe get it?
Why do you leave that job?
That's more time. Me make the jump bigger.
How long you with that job?
10 months?
10 months? Me hear you leave after 2 months. Me hear you leave and go travel around playing with friends. Me too. Me don't try to chase for something.
Me just want to play. Me got just system. Yeah. Lovely. Little.
But they brought in the panel interview as a remedy to the problems with interviews. You have more than one interviewer, and this might be used to cancel out each of the interviewer's biases. Of course, this doesn't work if all the interviewers share the same biases. The interview has also been standardized, where each interviewee is asked exactly the same questions, but the findings still show that these modified versions of the interview, they're better, but they're still quite poor. So why are employment interviews still so popular as a selection device? Well, this might be largely because they are a good way for an employer to recruit good employees, as it allows the employer to sell themselves. There's a big assumption in psychological testing that the person sitting the test is the only one being tested, but there's a basic truth in psychology that you might have come across, that might have occurred to you, that it says that the thing we are observing is simultaneously observing us. It's not one-way traffic. Now, not all of us are in a position to be headhunted by employers and have employers queuing up to persuade us to take a job with them, but employers are competing with other employers to get the best candidate for the job, so they do need to impress their applicants to persuade the applicant that they're a good employer. There's nothing worse than your preferred candidate turning you down or giving someone a job and then having them leave for a better job a few months later. So employers know that they are being evaluated by the interviewee. So the interview is a good place for the employer to impress the applicant. Now, the popularity of the employment interview might also say something about the tendency in psychological testing to atomize the individual, to reduce them down to a few discrete variables or attributes that are then measurable, like intelligence, like personality. But what's being lost is the big picture, the whole picture. It may well be that the results of psychological tests are insufficient for employers because the employer senses that these tests are only providing an incomplete picture, that the tests don't give sufficient insight into what the person is like. So the employer defaults to the interview, holds on to the interview as a selection method as a way to get a fuller picture of who the person is. It gives a more complete picture. You actually get a sense of who the person is by being in a room with them or being in conversation with them for a while. Okay, that's enough, I think, for this final podcast, this final recorded lecture. I hope you've enjoyed these recordings, and I hope they've given you stuff to think about. And I really hope they've sparked off some discussion between you and your fellow classmates, and anyone else, really, who cares to listen about psychology and what we do in psychology. So I hope to see you in class for week 11. Week 12, we won't have a recorded lecture. We're just going to focus that week on the exam revision and some overall summing up of the unit. So, till then, I don't want to say ta-da now. I don't want to say ta-da. Kind of enjoy talking to you through these things, these podcasts. Anyway, I've got to say ta-da, haven't I? There we go. Nice and unemotional, detached, professional. Ta-da. I don't know why I'm saluting you. I don't know why.